What's up, YouTube? Today we are working on this big old mounted wall hanging letter. In this video in particular, we're gonna be looking at the way I texture and I tool and stuff like that. So it's gonna be a closer look into the actual tooling and how I get all my textures and stuff like that. Thank you for watching. We're gonna jump in. So first off, we trace the design on. I had drew it first, and then I didn't really like how small it was, so I actually scanned it over and blew it up about 10-20%. But once we get all the design traced over, we move into the carving, which is going to be where we're going to end up tooling and beveling. And this is what makes the design actually permanent in the leather once the surface is cut. Then I will move into the basic initial beveling step. The beveling, although it does add texture, what the beveling really is it makes the design actually three-dimensional, where it looks like the layers are on top of each other before we go into texturing. So after all the beveling is done, I go into texturing. This is where we add texture to the rest of the tooling, as well as get rid of any marks that we may have from tracing or the drawing process. The first texture I do is the Thumbprint Tool or the Pear shader. And what I do is I smack the center of all of the petals basically with this guy. And this helps kind of give the petals a little bit more of a 3D effect. So the petals are already 3D, but this is going to give it a little bit of extra depth and kind of accents. So along with all the petals, I also use this tool to create texture on some of the flowers that I do. You can see kind of each one of these bumps gets its own line down, and then I might come back in and just give it a little bit of texture in between. Then, depending on what type of leaves that I'm feeling on any given particular day, I will use this tool on my leaves as well. This particular style, I like to use them on. I was looking at this flower and I wanted to give it a little bit more texture. So I'm gonna come back to it and give it a little love. That way it kind of fades out a little bit more. So I'm coming back to this flower. I haven't done one of these in quite a while, like this particular style flower. So I'm gonna try and have some fun with it, and maybe I can do something kind of creative. I'm going to be using the grooved pear shaders. This is a very similar tool. It does basically the same thing as the tool I just used, but it's a little bit shorter, and this particular one has lines. Some are smooth, some have texture. It just depends on what texture pear shader you have. So since this flower is kind of pointy, that's why I went with the lines, just so that way maybe it can kind of accentuate some of the pointiness and the flow of it. But first off, I know I want to give this a nice fade. I want to make sure that I keep the flow of these lines going with the flow of the lines here. You can see the flow of the lines are going along the actual lines of the flower itself, or petals itself. You know, I'm kind of liking that. I was not really knowing what I was gonna do, but I'll take it. I'm going in with this smaller, more narrow dude with the point to kind of make a little bit sharper of a point down on the end, and then kind of fade these lines a little bit better. And then I don't know if I'm gonna kill it or do something smart, but we're gonna give it a shot. So I'm gonna go like this, and I'll use the middle size guy just because I can get all three of them in there. So I kind of like that. It's kind of funky. Like I said, I haven't done one of these flowers in a really long time, so wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm definitely feeling it. So now I'm going to move on to the next texturing tool I like to use, and that's the Cedar Tool, which basically these create the illusion of like a seed or a little dot. Basically they're little dots. I like to use them on the center of my flowers, and it gives the illusion of kind of looking like seeds. This flower that I'm doing isn't necessarily a sunflower, but it's giving off serious sunflower vibes. So that's kind of why I'm choosing to give this flower this kind of seed look. Moving back over to this guy, we're gonna do the same thing, but the cedar is much smaller. Before we go any farther, I'm going to get rid of some of these lines from the tracing. I like to do this kind of after the fact because the Pear shader and this Thumbprint tool gets rid of a lot of the lines that I have. Also, I like to keep some of the lines there, like this particular line. I'm gonna keep it because it kind of goes really well with the flow of the petal. So I do like having the option of using those lines themselves as kind of a little bit of an accent. Like if you notice right here, this is kind of all moving in the direction that the rest of the design is. So other than that, we're looking real good. We're gonna move on to one of the last texturing tools, which I like to use, the Scallop Tool. This is kind of a throwback tool. Some people use it, some people don't these days. It's either a love-hate thing, and I use this tool in a handful of different ways, just depending on what kind of floral and what I'm working with. So on these particular loop over kind of style petals, like this guy and this guy, how it's a petal but it loops back on itself and you can see the underside, I like to use the Scallop Tool on the underside of the petal. And it gives it this kind of look. Another use for this tool that I really like is on this kind of, I don't really know what to call these. I like to just call them like Cuppy Petals, because that's basically all the only thing that kind of makes sense. How this petal right here is kind of making a taco cup side, and we're seeing the under back side of it. That's kind of what these kind of petals are, where it's coming up like a taco like this. So this is like the outside of the petal here, and then this is like the inside of the petal. So whenever it's like the inside or the back side of petals, I like to give it this texture. It just kind of helps give the design a little bit of a cohesive, like the cup over here is going to be the same as the cup on that side, and that whole deal. So here's the same thing. This is like a petal that is cupping, and these vines are coming out of that cup. I don't know if you can see what I'm talking about, but I'm gonna give these guys a little texture. Here we go, here's another one. So this is cupping out and these petals are coming out of it. Another use for this tool that I like is doing my leaves. Okay, and then the last thing, well actually there's two last things that I like to use this tool on. So I like to use this on the scrolls. These I like to call petals, and then this I would consider is a scroll. So what I'll do is take the natural curve of this tool and kind of work it into the ball or the head of the scroll and figure out what's gonna make the nicest, roundest circle. Like you see how kind of shifted in, and then like boom right there, how it makes a really nice head of that scroll. I'll start there, give it a good smack, and then lightly kind of fade it out to where it's about perpendicular, and then work it back up the top. And then the very last thing is sometimes I will just kind of smack them randomly on the vines, just that way gives it a little bit more texture. Like here we have this really big chunk that's kind of plain and funky looking, so I'll come in, give it a little bit of texture, and that way we got a little something something on there. Even down here at the base of these petals, kind of funky looking, so we'll give it a little something something. And then that for the most part is the texturing. So now we're gonna move on to the background. Since this is a relatively big tooling that we have, I'm gonna use a little bit of a larger backgrounder, something that's a little more chunky that we can cover a little bit more ground in. Normally I'm using a little bit finer grain on the background. Notice the texturing on this one down here is much bigger, whereas the one down here is a little bit smaller. So I'm gonna use my larger set on this one. So this is gonna smash that background down and really give this piece a three-dimensional look, where it looks like it's not only three-dimensional but hovering above the background space itself. So if you noticed, I was backgrounding in these rows, and now you can see what I have. So that's the fastest way to get the background down. But then in order to get rid of these rows, what I will do is I'll basically roll this backgrounding tool and get rid of those lines, and then it doesn't look so uniform. So now on to the very last texturing tool, which is the very first tool in the tooling, which is a swivel knife. And now we use a swivel knife to do decorative cuts. So what decorative cuts are is each crafter has a different technique for the decorative cuts that they do. Some like to use decorative cuts as a little bit of shading. There's all kinds of different ways that people could do decorative cuts. The way that I personally like to do my decorative cuts is to highlight the flow of the piece, the natural flow of the piece. So in all these petals and all these pear shader marks, and how all this stuff, how it flows, you know, everything is kind of coming back on itself. You know, we want to accentuate the actual flow of it. So what we're gonna do is use decorative cuts to add basically more lines to accentuate all those flows. So if you notice, this particular petal makes this kind of curvy shape. So what I'm gonna do is kind of do a little guy right here, and then maybe a little bit longer of a dude right there. Same with all this stuff. So this to come out the top and give the illusion that it dives under. And the same thing with the flow of the whole floral piece. I like to do that same decorative cut technique with the flow of the petals of my flowers as well. I said I haven't done one of these in a while, so I'm just gonna use my intuition and follow my lines the same way I have been. Right. So what I'll do sometimes is I'll work in my biggest lines first, and then from there kind of figure out what other small ones I want to do. And I kind of like that. And these are gonna really pop once we get some stain in there. So that is how I get all my texturing in my tooling. So before I finish everything else, I have a couple cool textures that I wanted to show you guys on some flowers over on this side. But for this effect, I take a beveler and I bevel very lightly to get these lines here. And then this guy, I use the Pear shader to get some of these lines as well. What I'm doing is dropping down each one of these little sections, pear shading right off the side of it so that the little drops appear bigger than they are, and trying to leave these ridges so then it gives it the most three-dimensional kind of look as possible. You'll probably be able to see it really good on these ones. So you can see I'm dropping each level, how it drops down, I'm just dropping it down a little bit farther and then accentuating those high points. So again, I basically just took these rounded edges and then beveled in lines like this. So I'm knocking down those layers to give it a little bit more of a staggered look, making these bevels look more extreme. I don't do this technique very often on my flowers, but doing it here, I am really enjoying it. So this is definitely something I'm going to be doing more often. And just for funsies, I'm going to change the center. And before I finish this piece off in time lapse, I want to show you guys how I planned on swivel knifing these flowers. Still same concept as before. We want to accentuate all the lines and natural curves that we already have going. I'm always trying to make sure I kind of randomize the lines. Like if I go, you know, high on this side, the next petal over I'll try and go high on the other side and try and mix them up. Because you don't want it to look too robotic. Since we're trying to create like a natural thing, you always got to remember that hardly ever is like nature geometric. It's got a lot of little variations and stuff. And one of the things that's gonna help your floral tooling out the most is trying to give it randomized, ununiform things that give it more of a natural look. There we go. There's the texture on these other flowers that I do. Now I'm gonna wrap this puppy up, do everything I just did to that side, the bevelers, Pear shaders, Scallop Tool, background, all that stuff. But I'm really excited how this thing is turning out. I love doing these letters. I haven't done one in a while, so I like how this one's turning out. Anyways, I'm gonna shut the hell up and get to it. So to finish out the piece, it is all the same steps that I just showed you, all in the same order. You know, we're gonna do the Pear shader, the Scallop Tool, the backgrounder, the decorative cuts, all that good stuff. And then we're gonna go on to finishing work, where I will do some brown stain around the borders and the background so the floral pops even harder, and then add a little bit of paint to that anchor and then stain it up. And then we are going to do the rest of the finishing work, like back it, throw it on the sewing machine. We're going to trim off the backing, which is very, very stressful, this next step here. You can slice into the letter very easily. After that, we're going to do the edges. We're going to edge bevel them, sand them, all that good stuff, and then hit it with some edge dressing and slick the sides. Here it is. This thing turned out super sick. It's going to be a nice big old centerpiece to hang up on the wall somewhere. Punchy Western stuff. How can you go wrong? I love making these things. These things get ordered a lot as like gifts for weddings, anniversaries, housewarming gifts, stuff like that. I always have a blast making these big letters and brands and stuff. They always turn out super sick, and they're also super personalized and super personal, and they usually live in like people's living rooms, bedrooms, stuff like that. So being a part of people's lives every single day where they see my work, super cool, super meaningful, and I love doing it. So thank you guys for watching, tuning in. I appreciate it. Make sure you hit the like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good shit that all the other YouTubers say. But for now, I'm gonna log off and make another video for you guys.